Welcome to the Driving the World podcast series. I'm your host, Cully Holland. Today we have Austin Burdette, our industrial gear product manager, and we're going to be discussing external cooling and breathers. Hey, Austin, thanks so much for joining us. We had such a good conversation last time. We're going to have another one. So this time it looks like we're talking a little bit about external cooling and breathers, especially when it pertains to our industrial gearing portfolio. So let's just start at the top. And what is external cooling and breathers, and why do we care?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me back, Coley. Yeah, let's talk about it, man. So, like you said, we'll be talking about external coolers and breathers, especially as it pertains to big industrial gearboxes. So, just a little bit of the what we're talking about. External coolers, it's a lot like the radiator on your car. So, it's a heat exchanger that's cooling oil by pumping it through a matrix of pipes, which is one type like we use as a pipe heat exchanger, and that increases the surface area of the oil, and then you can force some sort of cooling fluid across it to then cool it through convective cooling. And I think this is really neat because we actually see this similar design in nature. So we've all seen an elephant, right, in the zoo or on the Nature Channel or something. So elephants are such big animals, just like our industrial gearboxes are such large gearboxes, that they really need to cool their blood down or the oil down. So their heart, much like a pump, will pump the blood through their ears. And so when you look at an elephant under like a thermal camera, you actually see a really cold spot on their large ears. And so the ears and the blood vessels inside are spreading out their blood or the oil in the heat exchanger. And then when they flap their ears, they're putting some air against it so you can actually cool the blood down. So it's a very similar way with the external coolers, especially the air type.
Well, dang, that's awesome. Just learned something new. Every day is a school day. And
Absolutely.
so that's, I guess, very high level, cool tidbit about external coolers. And how do breathers play a role?
Sure. Yeah. So breathers are super important too. So two main things to remember about a gearbox breather is number one, it vents, allows the gearbox to breathe literally as the air inside heats up. It expands and wants to push air out of the gearbox. And then as it's turned off and it cools down, it wants to pull ambient air inside. So you have to have some provision for venting. Otherwise, the seals would just pop out and then oil would go everywhere, which is not ideal. And then the second function is it has to filter that air, because if you have a gearbox in, let's say, a concrete facility, a cement facility, you have a very dusty environment and you don't want that contaminant getting into the oil.
So it sounds like breathers are quite important themselves. So I'm glad we're going to be talking about them. So that's kind of what they are and the functions they play. So I guess that's a little bit of the why, but do we have a little bit more of a why do we use them? Why are they so common in these large industrial gearboxes?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, why should you care, right? So, kind of a big picture of why you should care about the external coolers and breathers is both components allow your gearbox to have a prolonged life. So, they help prevent failure. So, not every gearbox needs an external cooler or even a shaft fan, like we talked about in the last podcast. Sometimes you don't need any additional cooling, but in many cases, you may need an external cooler for the really high horsepower, fast output speed applications, right? So that gearbox oil, if it does not have a cooler and needs a cooler, will become very thin. It won't cushion that gear mesh the proper way. And then you get metal on metal contact, which leads to very bad things and also degrades your oil over time. So definitely could cause failure if you need a cooler and don't have one. And then also for breathers, why should you need them or care about them? Same reason it can lead to failure if you don't have the proper breather sized up for the application.
Well, for those of our listeners that are aware or maybe not aware, some of these gearboxes can be a little higher on the cost side. So anything that can prevent a failure that is preventable is definitely something we want to look into and talk to our customers and our end users about. So let's talk about external coolers just a little bit more. Are there different types? Do they have different roles or functions? And just what could they see when they're looking for external coolers out in the field?
Yeah, definitely. So we have two main types. So we have air to oil, and then we have water to oil. So we kind of talked a little bit about that example in nature of the elephant ears. So that would be your air to oil cooler. So won't go into that too much, but basically you're using your air to then cool the oil. Something really important to note there is there's a limitation with the ambient air temperature. So if you're in a very hot environment, like let's say maybe like metal processing, like a smelting facility, then you're not going to want to use this like 200-degree Fahrenheit air to then cool your oil. It's actually going to heat it up, be like a convection oven, right? So we don't want to do that. So that's one consideration is the ambient air temperature. The other consideration with the air coolers is just make sure that that heat exchanger matrix doesn't get clogged up with something. especially like, again, that cement facility illustration. You don't want to use them in very dusty environments typically. And if you do, just make sure to clean them.
A little bit of preventive maintenance can go a long way, especially when it's
Absolutely.
just light to heavy dusting to keep those things clean. And yeah, hot air probably does not cool hot oil too well. So
Exactly.
that's our air external coolers. And you also mentioned water external coolers. What are those about?
Absolutely, yeah. So when the air is not sufficient, we can use water actually as the cooling fluid instead of air. So kind of piggybacking on the conversation with the air to oil cooler is that they actually really shine when it comes to a hot ambient environment, like a metal processing facility or something like that. So kind of the limitation there, though, is although they're better for hot environments, that you have to make sure your plant water is very clean because you can foul up the water heat exchanger with some dirty water. So.
Good to know. Two very good points on the water heat exchangers. And I think we kind of touched a lot of bases on external coolers. If anything comes in mind, we can cover it at the end of the podcast. But
Sure.
what about these breathers? I see you brought a few. So for our folks watching, they can see them.
Mhm.
But for the folks listening, let's maybe go through and discuss what they are and maybe some of the differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like the point you made earlier, Cooley, about a cost adder. So these industrial gearboxes are not cheap units. They're very large, right? And this is these breathers are really great examples of a very relatively inexpensive cost adder that we can include that if sized properly or selected properly for the environment and the application, really go a long way in prolonging the life of your gearbox. Whereas the external coolers are a little bit on the pricier side, right? But often very necessary. So just kind of starting from your end and then working towards me. So that first one you see, the tiny guy, is just a standard breather.
Okay.
So nothing too crazy there. Again, it's still performing the function of allowing it to vent, the gearbox to vent. And then there's a little bit of filtration going on, nothing too crazy. Like if you have a very dusty environment, I would suggest something closer towards me, towards the desiccant side.
All right. So we got our standard. What are we looking at right next to?
Sure. Then the next one is a stainless steel breather. These are great for washdown environments where the unit's going to be maybe pressure washed or some sort of chemical is going to be used to wash it. Inside it, I wish you could open it and see it, but it's unfortunately closed off. But there's like a kind of like a steel wool type of mesh inside, so there is some particle filtration, but not a ton, not as much as like a desiccant breather.
Gotcha. So we're working our way down the table. What is this third one we're looking at?
Sure. So this looks a lot like just the air intake, like air filter on your car engine. You can actually open it up and look inside. It's just like a little, Fran air filter or something, right? So the positive there is it's great for dusty environments and also still allows for venting or breathing. And you can change those filters out as well. So that's a nice bonus.
A little more preventive maintenance that could go a long way, just keeping your filters happy, healthy, and clean. And that leaves us with one more, the most imposing one on the table.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at there?
Sure. So the big boy, I always think it looks like it's full of pop rocks personally, but it's just desiccant beads.
Okay.
So not supposed to eat those. Found that out the hard way. Just kidding. So yes, this is our desiccant breather. Super great breather. Definitely our premium option, I would say. Really great for really any sort of environment. You can change the desiccant out, so it also has that. Something really important that I wanted to mention, a lot of people don't realize, is on the bottom of the breather, there's actually these little like plastic tabs, and you're supposed to remove at least 2 of those before operation. Very important. Otherwise, the gearbox won't be allowed to breathe, and you won't be filtering the air like we discussed. So really great option here for virtually any application. And also just to throw out there, our application engineers will add any breather that you want. So you can definitely specify that as well if you have a particular choice you want.
Well, fantastic. And always love to see a few options for the very vast range of applications and industries these gearboxes can find themselves in. I think we touched a lot on breathers. Has anything popped up? Anything else you want to cover about external coolers or breathers, or did we about get it all done?
Sure. I'll go ahead and throw in there back on the cooling discussion that we do have some other cooling options as well. And of course, heating options too. So that would be like a water cooling coil or like an air-cooled cover, which just gives you some fins on the inspection cover of your gearbox. So we have a lot of different options for cooling, in addition to the shaft-driven fans, and then also the heat exchangers we discussed. And then also for heating, we have some heating rods that we can include as well.
Well, it sounds like we definitely have options and a few accessories for these industrial gearboxes. And as always, Austin, we really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Happy to be here.